All right, and you can begin. Thank you.
Perfect. Welcome, guys. We're going to go ahead and get started. Before I do, I just want to make one quick announcement to y'all. I have a second monitor right here, so if you ever see me looking this way, I promise I'm either filling out a ballot or writing comments for y'all, and that is not me not paying attention. Perfect. Well, that's getting started. Can we go ahead and start with introductions?
Yes, of course, Your Honor. Would you like the plaintiff to go first?
Yes, that will work.
Good afternoon. My name is Rachel Medina, and along with my co-counsels, Jilly Canales.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
And Alyssa Villarreal.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
We represent the plaintiff in today's case, the estates of Genesis Petrillo v. Harper Martini.
Good afternoon. Can I get introductions from the defense?
Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, my name is Joshua Wagner, and along with my co-counsel, Victoria Hofflinger and Cameron Viss, we will be representing the defense on behalf of Peony Estates.
And good afternoon, defense counsel. Let's go ahead and proceed. Does the plaintiff have any pretrial matters they'd like to discuss?
Yes, Your Honor. We have a few pretrial matters. Seeing as this is our first time in your courtroom, we also have some preferences of yours that we would like to be clear with. First of all, whenever we are putting demonstratives or exhibits on the screen, would you like us to ask permission to do so first or do so as necessary?
You can do so as you please.
Of course. And is it safe to assume that the exhibits are constructively unseen by jury until they are entered into evidence?
Yes, they are.
And at this time, Your Honor, we would like to invoke Rule 603, which is the constructive pre-swearing of all witnesses.
That rule is invoked.
We would also like to invoke the Rule 615, which is the constructive sequestration of all witnesses barring party representatives. And as the plaintiff today, we have no party representative.
Yes. Does the defense counsel have any party representatives today?
Yes, Your Honor. We would like to designate Harper Martini as our party representative.
Perfect. Thank you. Any more matters from the plaintiff?
Yes, Your Honor. We would also like to direct your attention to some case law at this time. The first of which can be found on page 1 of the case law document. Also at this time, I would like to verify that you have the case materials such as case law, rules of evidence, and stipulations with you.
Yes, I should have them all with me right here.
So the first piece of case law is found on page 1. It is Burdett v. Copenhaver. This case addresses the 3 elements of civil battery we will be addressing today, which is an act by the defendant, an intent to cause a harmful act, and that this harmful act was indeed suffered by the plaintiff.
Perfect. That is my understanding of that case as well, and it is noted.
The next piece of case law that we would like to direct your attention to can be found directly below Burdett v. Copenhaver. It is Jacob v. Alexander. This case states that the touching necessary for battery to occur is not strictly limited to the physical contact between the defendant and the plaintiff, but rather can occur by the defendant placing a harmful substance into food or drink that the defendant voluntarily or not consumes.
Perfect. That is also my understanding of Jacob v. Alexander, and it is noted.
The final thing I'd like to direct your attention to can be found on page 1 of the stipulations document. It is stipulation 3. And this merely states that exhibits 1 through 10 are pre-admitted into evidence and as such may be referred to during opening statements.
Perfect. That is my understanding as well. For a point of clarification, if either party tends to use exhibit 1 through 10, if you could just let me know that that is the exhibit that you are showing when y'all decide to do so. And you don't have to do that on any statement.
Yes, Your Honor. And with that, the plaintiff is ready to proceed with opening statements.
Perfect. Are there any pretrial motions from the defense?
No, Your Honor.
Perfect. Well, with that, we can proceed to openings. The plaintiff, do you have an opening statement prepared for us today?
Yes, Your Honor.
And you may proceed.
Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury, may it please the court. She thought no one would notice. Members of the jury, today you are going to learn about how one person can have so much hatred for another. Genesis Petrillo and Casey Soto were 2 young adults madly in love with one another. The 2 met in college and were so committed to each other that they decided to take the next step in their relationship and get engaged. The happy couple had the rest of their married lives to be with one another. But that has all been cut short. On June 7th, 2019, the night of the rehearsal dinner, Mr. Soto went to bed expecting to see Genesis walk down the aisle the very next day. But instead, he was informed that Genesis was in the hospital in a coma due to poisoning. And later, Mr. Soto found out his bride-to-be died. Mr. Soto missed the love of his life's last breath by only 5 minutes. And to make matters worse, members of the jury, it is because of Mr. Soto's own parent, the defendant Harper Martini, that we are here today. Today, you are going to hear a lot about the defendant's winery, Peony Estates. It was at this winery that the happy couple had their wedding rehearsal, and it is this wedding rehearsal that brings us here today. During the wedding rehearsal, the defendant gifted Genesis a bottle of Cara wine. And although this seems like a nice gesture, you'll learn that this was actually poisoned with pesticides by the defendant for Genesis. Today, you are going to learn that Genesis was the only one who drank from the bottle of Cara wine. Genesis was the only one who experienced any type of poisoning. And Genesis was the only one who died. The evidence will show you how the defendant was fully aware of what lethal pesticides such as organophosphate could do to someone when ingested. You are going to hear about how the defendant thought nobody would notice if she added pesticides in the wine for Genesis. Lastly, you will learn that after recovering the bottle of wine from Genesis's room, it tested positive for organophosphate pesticide, the same pesticide that the defendant uses in her winery, Peony Estates. Today, you are going to hear from a friend the happy couple shared, Angel Rodriguez. And Mrs. Rodriguez is going to tell you how Harper hated Genesis and how Genesis truly feared for her life. You are also going to hear from Mr. Soto himself. Mr. Soto is going to tell you how his own mother hated Genesis and that he is here today because he is terrified of what the defendant is capable of. Lastly, you will hear from Dr. Kwan, an expert toxicologist who examined and autopsied Genesis's body. Dr. Kwan is going to talk to you about the lethal effects of organophosphate pesticide, especially when mixed with wine. Dr. Kwan is going to tell you that that is the cause of death for Genesis. Today, as the plaintiff, we must prove to you by a preponderance of the evidence that the defendant is liable for battery. First, we must prove that the defendant committed an act. Second, that the defendant's act was intended to cause harm. And third, that in result, Genesis Petrillo was harmed. To help you understand the burden a little bit more, I want you to know that you only have to believe our facts a little bit more than the story the defense is going to tell you today. Even if you believe us 0.0001% more, that is all you need to find the defendant liable for battery. In a few moments, the defense will come before you and try to convince you that this is just a classic case of a parent not liking their child's partner. But you are going to learn that not only did the defendant want for Genesis to disappear, the defendant even tried to pay Genesis $30,000 to disappear so that nobody would notice. At the end of today's trial, my co-counselor, Jilly Canales, will come before you and ask you to find the defendant liable for battery because she thought that no one would notice. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Villarreal. Is that correct? Perfect. Defense, do you have an opening statement for us?
Yes, Your Honor.
And you may proceed.
Thank you. May it please the court. Perceptions can be deceiving. The truth is that the facts in today's case do not show any actions taken by Harper Martini done with the intent to cause harm. Plaintiff's counsel will spin you a story today. They will talk about everything that Harper Martini said, but not what Harper Martini did. Her actions were never taken with the intent to harm anyone. You will see today that the real Harper Martini is someone who cares. The evidence of Harper's actions will corroborate this truth. She cared too much about the winery to take actions with regard to the usage of pesticides that would put the winery in danger of being shut down. And as you will hear, she intended to pass on Peony Estates to her child, Casey. Her actions support this notion. The evidence will show that Harper Martini cared too much about her child to ever hurt someone that they loved. Now, to prevail on the claim of civil battery, the plaintiff must fulfill the burden of proof as stated by opposing counsel Villarreal. This means that they must fill all elements of the claim pursuant to Burdett v. Copenhaver, including that my client Harper Martini took actions against Genesis Petrillo, that these actions were performed with the intent to cause harm or offensive contact towards Genesis Petrillo, and finally, that the intended harm or contact was in fact consummated. Now, in our case in chief, we will be calling 3 witnesses to the stand. First, we will call Austin Lewis. Now, Austin Lewis is a longtime employee at Peony Estates and knows every procedure and practice that is followed with respect to cleanliness and proper storage of hazardous materials. He will explain the practices exercised and cautions taken at Peony Estates to ensure the safety and quality of the products produced. Next, Blaine Osborne will testify. She was the planner for the wedding of Genesis Petrillo and Casey Soto. She will explain her working relationship over the last years with Harper Martini and Peony Estates, and will describe her perceptions of the cleanliness and safety precautions taken by Harper Martini. Finally, Martini herself will testify. She will explain the exact nature of her relationship with Genesis and her true opinions on Casey and Genesis's relationship. She will explain where and when pesticides were present at Peony Estates and the exact events as they occurred on June 8, 2019. Through her testimony, Martini will show that she had no intent to cause Genesis physical harm and indeed took no actions to that end. Finally, members of the jury, if opposing counsel's claims are to be believed, if my client intended to consummate harmful contact toward Genesis Petrillo by means of the Cara wine, important questions arise. Why would Harper Martini give the poisoned wine to Petrillo exclusively, as we will learn? Why would Harper Martini give it to why would Harper Martini give it to Genesis Petrillo, as the evidence will show, in front of the entirety of the wedding party present? As you listen to the testimony today, consider these questions. Ask yourselves if Harper Martini's actions really show an intent to cause harm, or if Harper is simply expressing the ways in which she cares for her child. At the end of today's trial, the plaintiff will have failed to meet their burden of proof, and we will ask that you find in favor of Harper Martini. Thank you.
Thank you. Is the plaintiff ready to begin their case in chief?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the plaintiff calls Angel Rodriguez to the stand.
Thank you. Ms. Rodriguez, you are now on the stand, and plaintiff counsel, you can begin when ready.
Please introduce yourself to the court.
Hi, I'm Angel Rodriguez.
What do you do for a living, Mrs. Rodriguez?
I'm currently a kindergarten teacher at Rapid River Valley Elementary School, and let me tell you, trying to teach kindergartners over Zoom is probably the hardest thing ever.
Why are you here today?
I'm here because my good friend Genesis passed away on June 8th, 2019. I just want to share what I know about what happened.
Now I want to talk about Miss Petrillo some more. When did you meet?
I met her and Casey, her fiance, through our mutual friend. We instantly became best friends, like kindergartners on the first day of school.
What was it like being best friends with Genesis and Casey?
It was a blast. Even though they were dating, I never felt like the third wheel around them. And when they announced that they were getting engaged, I was so happy. You could tell how much they loved each other. I wish I could find true love like that one day. They even asked me to be a part of the wedding party.
Miss Rodriguez, I want to talk to you about the defendant. Do you know Mrs. Martini?
Yes, but I don't know her very well.
How do you know Mrs. Martini?
Harper is Casey's mom, also the owner of Peony Estates, which is where the wedding ended up being planned to happen.
You mentioned earlier that you were invited to be part of the wedding party. What can you tell us about the planning of the wedding?
Well, I got to see a lot of the behind the scenes things, and I also got to see what I thought was the worst of Harper.
Well, what do you mean?
Well, Harper would always try to change the things that Casey and Genesis wanted. Like, the wedding wasn't even supposed to be at Peony Estates, but Harper made them change it. All of the drama with Harper made things pretty tense, especially between Harper and Genesis.
What made you feel that there was tension?
Well, Harper was always criticizing and insulting Genesis. Most of the things Genesis wanted, Harper had something negative or mean to say. She wouldn't agree with her on anything, and things just got worse.
How did things get worse?
Someone was always arguing with someone, and the conflict started to get more explosive, even on the night of the wedding rehearsal.
What day was the wedding rehearsal?
That was June 7th, 2019. The night everything happened.
So I want to talk a little bit about June 7th, 2019. What happened at the rehearsal dinner?
Harper and Genesis couldn't stop fighting. And if you thought kindergartners fought a lot, you haven't seen anything until you've seen those two. Harper even said that Genesis should leave and save this family the heartache, otherwise, I will make you disappear.
What did you do when you heard that?
Well, I tried to ask Genesis what happened, but all she said was she was afraid Harper was going to kill her. She looked terrified.
So what happened that night?
I saw Harper holding a canister of pesticide right before her toast.
Did the defendant say anything about the canister of pesticide she was holding?
Yes, she said it was for Genesis.
What happened after the defendant said the canister of pesticide was for Genesis?
Harper gave 2 toasts after that. The first one was super negative about Genesis and made her shake under the table. And the second one was really random and only addressed towards Genesis.
What happened during the second toast?
Harper was being weirdly nice to Genesis all of a sudden. She even gave her a special bottle of wine that no one else got. It was called Cara.
So let's talk about the wine some more. What did Genesis do with the wine Cara?
After getting it around 10 p.m., I saw her pour multiple glasses of the wine from Harper.
How did Genesis physically appear after drinking the Cara wine from Harper?
Around 11 p.m., she started stumbling and her speech seemed slurred. I never seen her like that before. It got so bad after a few drinks with our friend Drew that I called 911 around 12:42 a.m.
So what happened after you called 911?
We went in an ambulance to the ER, and I waited with her all night.
Now let's talk about the next morning. What happened?
Around 8 a.m., I found out from the doctor that Genesis had slipped into a coma from what seemed to be some kind of poisoning. I went back to Peony Estates to let Casey know.
So what happened when you went back to Peony Estates?
I ran into Harper, but before I could even say anything, Harper somehow already knew that Genesis had been poisoned, and she was already planning on canceling the wedding. I don't even know how she knew that Genesis had been poisoned, though.
What happened when Mr. Soto found out?
Him and I went to the hospital, but we were too late.
What do you mean by you were too late?
By the time we got there, around 9:32 a.m., Genesis had already been dead for 5 minutes. That was one of the most heartbreaking things in my life.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you. Does the defense have a cross-examination of this witness? You may proceed. Is there any way that you can speak up? I'm having a hard time hearing you, and I don't know if the others are in the same boat.
Hello, Ms. Rodriguez.
Hello.
So you witnessed how much Harper cared about Casey, correct?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? You cut out a bit.
You witnessed how much Harper cared about Casey, correct?
Yes.
And Casey was heartbroken when Genesis died, correct?
Yes, they were supposed to get married.
And during the course of that wedding preparation, you witnessed Genesis drinking several glasses of wine.
Yeah, the special wine that Harper gave her.
And you also saw Genesis drinking champagne the same night.
Yes, but she wasn't drinking as much as normal until she got that special wine.
But then you also saw Genesis at the bar ordering tequila shots for everyone.
Yes, but she didn't drink any of them that I saw.
But you were focused on a conversation with Drew Matsukas. You weren't focusing on Casey, correct?
That's right, but I'm pretty sure Drew and I drank most of them. I didn't see her drink anything.
And after Genesis ordered those shots, you saw them slumped over the bar snoring.
Yes.
And so after Genesis was drinking wine and champagne and then ordering tequila shots, you found them vomiting and sweating in their hotel room, correct?
Yes, I never seen her like that before, and especially with how much she had drinking.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you. Any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor. May the witness be excused?
Yes, Ms. Rodriguez, you are excused. Does the plaintiff have any additional witnesses?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the plaintiff calls Dr. Kwan to the stand.
Dr. Kwan, you may take the stand. And counsel, you may proceed when you're ready.
Please introduce yourself to the court.
How are you doing? My name is Dr. Jim Kwan.
And what do you do for a living, Dr. Kwan?
I am the chief emergency physician as well as toxicology specialist at River Valley Hospital.
And what exactly does your job as chief emergency physician entail?
Well, I'm responsible for admitting patients into the ER as well as diagnosing them. Well, as I do accept all ER patients, I am usually assigned to poison cases as I am a toxicologist. I am responsible for diagnosing the various toxins and how to quickly reverse them.
So what type of education do you have to hold such a position?
Well, I have a bachelor's of science in chemistry in biology as well as a minor in chemistry. I received my MD from UNC at Chapel Hill, and I continued my residency at Emory Department of Emergency Medicine as well, and continued my fellowship in medical toxicology.
So have you ever been published in your field?
Yes, I have several peer-reviewed articles about toxicology as well as emergency medicine.
So can you tell us why you're here today in court?
Yes, I'm here today to explain the conclusions that I drew from the initial full examination of Genesis Petrillo and today's suspected poisoning case, as well as the laboratory findings that I ordered.
And so what kinds of facts and data did you have to draw this conclusion?
I initially met Genesis Petrillo in the emergency room, in which I conducted a full examination. I also utilized the laboratory findings that I ordered, which was the poison and toxin analysis test, which is exhibits 5 and 6, as well as other exhibits and the affidavit of Angel Rodriguez.
And were these sufficient to come to your conclusions?
Yes, they were.
So what type of method do you use when assessing a case like this?
I have a two-part method in which I use. The first is a full examination, utilizing the acronym EMP, which stands for eyes, muscles, and pulse. And then I utilize these symptoms to compare to laboratory findings.
And is this method reliable in your field?
Yes, it is actually the standard in my field. I can't recall a doctor who doesn't use this method.
And did you reliably apply this method to the data of today's case?
Yes, and several other poisoning cases.
So I want to talk to you about the first part of your examination with Petrillo, the full examination. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I initially met Genesis Petrillo in the ER, in which I noticed that he had fumes of alcohol on his breath, and he was severely vomiting a red liquid, which is usually consistent with wine. And I suspected this was an alcohol poisoning case, but then I later found out it wasn't.
Well, what made you believe that it wasn't an alcohol poisoning case?
Well, Petrillo's symptoms were contrary to those of alcohol poisoning cases. I mean, I utilized my symptoms EMP to conclude this. I actually brought a chart to further explain this.
Ms. Medina, can we put up the demonstrative aid for Dr. Kwan's testimony today? Thank you. Dr. Kwan, what are we looking at here?
Yes, this is a chart that explains the key differences between alcohol poisoning versus pesticide poisoning. And this is utilizing EMP. And this is what I utilized to conclude my deduction about Genesis pesticide.
So using this chart, what type of poisoning were Ms. Petrio's symptoms consistent with?
It was consistent with pesticide poisoning. And this was due to the fact that her symptoms were contrary to alcohol poisoning. As you can see, the eyes were dilated with alcohol poisoning. However, Petrio's symptoms were consistent with a contracted and tearing symptom. We can move on to muscle function. And this shows that muscle function will be relatively normal in alcohol poisoning cases, but Petrio's muscles were involuntarily twitching. And as we can also see, the very last part is pulse. And in alcohol poisoning, it's weak and rapid. However, Petrio was showcasing symptoms of irregular and a slow pulse.
Thank you, Ms. Medina. We can remove the demonstrative from the screen. So Dr. Kwan, were you able to confirm that Ms. Petrio came into contact with pesticides?
Yes, I was able to do this through the ordering of toxin and pesticide analysis tests.
And would you recognize those tests if I were to show them to you in court today?
Yes, I would.
Ms. Medina, can we display exhibits 5 and 6, which have already been entered into evidence per stipulation 3 onto the screen? Thank you. Now, Dr. Kwan, how did these tests confirm your suspicion that Ms. Petrio was suffering from pesticide poisoning?
Well, beginning with exhibit 6, it states that Genesis Petrio had organophosphate pesticides in her bloodstream. And as we move to exhibit 5, it showcases that Petrio's VAC level was 0.16%, which is inconsistent with lethality in alcohol poisoning cases.
And so how much might the amount of pesticide found in Ms. Petrio affect somebody?
Well, despite having a significant amount of pesticide in her bloodstream, even in small doses, pesticide is extremely lethal.
Thank you, Ms. Benita. We can stop sharing the exhibits on the screen. So, Dr. Kwan, do you know where this pesticide could have come from?
Well, there are 3 methods in which pesticides can enter into the bloodstream. And this is through inhalation, ingestion, and skin absorption. I was able to cancel out 2 methods, which was skin absorption and inhalation. So therefore, I was able to conclude that the only sole cause was through ingestion.
And based on your analysis, where did the pesticide come from if she were to ingest it?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, Genesis Petrio was severely vomiting a red liquid, which is usually consistent with wine. And due to this sole rejection of wine, I concluded that the ingestion of pesticides came from the wine. I was then able to confirm this through the testing of the wine bottle, which was tested positive, as well as her stomach content of wine also tested positive for pesticides.
So what is your overall conclusion regarding the death of Genesis Petrio?
I concluded that Genesis' unique symptoms were more consistent with pesticide poisoning than alcohol poisoning, and that we can solely acknowledge that the only set in stone reason that Genesis Petrio's death was caused by the ingestion of pesticide through wine.
Thank you, Your Honor. I have no further questions at this time.
Thank you, counsel. Does the defense, do you have a cross-examination of this witness?
Yes, Your Honor.
And you may proceed when ready.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Dr. Kwan.
Good afternoon.
Now, you're on the board of directors for Organic Solutions, correct?
Yes, sir, I am.
And this is an organization that opposes the use of chemical pesticides, right?
Of course, so we can end situations like this one.
Right. You personally believe that chemical pesticides are inherently a scourge on the environment and an immense danger to humanity, right?
Well, as we can see in today's case, it does lead to death of human beings.
Well, let's talk about today's case, Dr. Kwan. When Petrillo arrived at the emergency room, you could tell she was heavily intoxicated, right?
Yes, Petrillo did show signs of being intoxicated.
That's right. Petrillo had slurred speech, correct?
Yes, which is actually consistent with both pesticide and alcohol poisoning.
But Petrillo also smelled of alcohol, right?
Of course, that's where the wine came in and with which the pesticide was inside.
That's right. You observed wine that Petrillo had vomited onto herself, correct?
Yes, sir.
And Petrillo, in fact, told you that she had been drinking a lot of wine that evening, right?
Yes, sir, she was.
And it's true that Petrillo's blood alcohol content was measured at 0.16%, right?
Which, yes, it is. And that's not a lethal amount.
Now, Dr. Kwan, isn't it true that dependent upon how it was consumed, the blood alcohol content may have been higher previous?
And even if so, even if it was at 0.3%, which is the lethal amount, Petrillo would have died before reaching the ER, and her depreciation would not have reached 0.16 by the time she reached my table.
But Dr. Kwan, isn't it true that you can't say for certain that the wine found in Petrillo's stomach was contaminated with the pesticides?
Yes, I am, through the positive testing of the wine bottle, in which I did review.
Now, you made a sworn statement before this trial, did you not?
Yes, sir, I did.
And in that statement, you promised to be truthful and accurate?
Yes, sir, I did.
And you swore that you had nothing of importance to add to that statement?
No, sir, I have nothing to add or take away from my statement.
Now, do you have your statement in front of you, Dr. Kwan?
No, sir, I do not have it in front of me, but I do know which statement you are referring to.
Okay. So now, in that statement, you say that if Petrillo had ingested another contaminated food or
Objection to an improper impeachment at this point.
Counsel, do you have a response to this?
yes, Your Honor, with the mechanical deficiencies of this current platform, I was unable to supply Dr. Kwan with his statement.
Defense counsel, do you have the witness's report pulled up?
Yes, I can pull it up, Your Honor.
Perfect. If one of the counsels can screen share, that way we can make sure that Dr. Kwan is able to see exactly the specific words of his report.
Thank
Yes,
you.
Your Honor.
Perfect. The objection is overruled, perhaps, as long as we can get that up and show it to the witness.
Thank you, Your Honor.
I apologize. I'm trying to get it up as well, but it seems I am also having some difficulties with the
Yeah.
AMPA website.
I can take care of it. I've got it for you.
Okay, thank you so much.
I can pull it up as well.
Let's do this. To be clear, defense counsel, can you see this document?
Yes, Your Honor.
Can you point us to the line that you're referring to?
Yes, we'll be starting at line 160 and going through line 162.
Perfect. You may proceed.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Kwan, would you follow along silently as I read aloud in this section of your statement?
I believe you said 116, correct?
Correct.
For some reason, it's not showing up on my screen as 116. I am actually viewing 136. 150. 160?
160, yes.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Will you follow along silently as I read aloud? If Petrillo had ingested another contaminated food or drink item, it could have dissolved in Petrillo's stomach or combined with the wine, making the uncontaminated wine appear contaminated. Given the time frame, this is very unlikely, but it is a remote possibility. Now, I read that correctly, didn't I?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I have nothing further with this. Yeah.
But if may I respond, please?
I do not believe that counsel has asked a question. So at this time, I'm not going to permit you to respond to that question. Thank you, defense counsel. Plaintiff, do you have a redirect of this witness?
Briefly, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Dr. Kwan, just a moment ago, we read a line from your report. I want to give you the opportunity to explain what that line meant based on the answer that you gave to the previous question. Do you want to tell us what you meant?
Yes. Previously, I mentioned the case of reviewing the alcohol bottle, in which I did review the bottle which tested positive for alcohol poisoning, in which I was questioned on. I also did make the statement about appearance of having another substance. However, I was not questioned on that specific.
And Dr. Kwan, in your report, as we saw on cross-examination, it mentioned that it was a possibility that the solution did in fact dissolve within the patient's body. Can you tell us more about the likelihood that it did dissolve?
It is extremely significantly unlikely that it is possible that it could have. However, there is a slim chance that something else might have contaminated the wine. But due to her body's rejection of solely wine, this is the only possibility of.
Thank you, Your Honor. I have no further questions.
Thank you, counsel. Is there any recross from the defense?
No recross, Your Honor.
Perfect. Dr. Kwan, you may be excused. And plaintiff's counsel, do you have any further witnesses for us?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, plaintiff calls Casey Soto to the stand.
Ms. Soto, if you could please come to the stand. Mr. Soto, pardon me. And plaintiff's counsel, you may begin when ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. Would you please introduce yourself to the court?
Hi, I'm Casey Soto.
And what was the nature of your relationship to Genesis Petrillo?
This is my wife. She was my wife to be. Our passion was traveling. We loved to go all over the US, and we were waiting until after we got married to head out of the country. I miss her a lot.
And how did the two of you meet?
We met at Rosie and Pedro. She was dancing to Boyfriend by Justin Bieber, and I knew that I was going to be her boyfriend. I know it's really cheesy, but we had a genuinely perfect relationship. The only thing that wasn't perfect about it was my mom, Harper Martini.
Now, you've mentioned the defendant. Would you mind talking a little bit about your relationship?
Yeah, she is a really good mom. She took care of me all by herself when my dad left, and she's always had my back no matter what. The only thing that scares her is me leaving her.
And did the two of you have a perfect relationship?
No, it was okay. I mean, most of it was good. There were some parts that were a little rough. That's when we'd usually argue about Genesis and stuff like that.
And why did the two of you fight about Miss Petrillo?
Well, my mom owns her own winery, Peony Estates, and she's really proud of it. So she likes to show off all of her creations, and she was showing it off to Genesis, and Genesis didn't realize that it was her wine and made a rude comment about it, and my mom's been hostile ever since.
Now, you mentioned the defendant works at a winery. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, she used to work at Rosie and Pedro when I was a little kid, and then she opened her own place, Peony Estates. She loves that place second to only me. That's actually why the wedding location got changed to Peony.
And what happened with the wedding?
Well, my mom, bless her heart, took over everything of the wedding. She took over the catering, the location, signs, drapery, anything that she could take control of, she did. Genesis was not a fan of it whatsoever, so she confronted my mom.
And what exactly did Miss Petrillo do?
Well, they had a conversation, and they started screaming and yelling at each other, and I'm very scared of confrontation, so I left.
And did that confrontation change anything?
No, if it did anything, it made everything 10 times worse.
What do you mean?
Well, Genesis didn't get everything off her chest, so she called my mom later and let it slip that we wanted to leave for France.
And how did the defendant react?
Terribly, worse than you could possibly imagine. She screamed at Genesis, Casey has to stay in Midlands. Whether you stay with her, go to France yourself, or end up 6 feet under, I don't care.
And how did you react?
Well, I was terrified because up until this point, my mom had never threatened Genesis.
Mr. Soto, I want to talk about the rehearsal dinner now. When was that?
It was June 7th of 2019.
And how did things go at first?
As it usually goes, it was tense. Harper snapped at Genesis because she was late, just the usual snippy conversations. But what really scared me is what Genesis told me a little while later into the evening.
And what did Miss Petrillo tell you?
She said she was worried that Harper was going to try to hurt or harm her. Regardless of this, I said we should just push on with the wedding and hope everything works out.
Did you have any other conversations with the defendant that night?
Yes, I was really adamant about telling her that, look, it's my decision to go to France. It is not Genesis's, but she wouldn't have it, and she screamed at me that you can't break up our family.
Did you hear from the defendants again that night?
Yeah, they had toasts, and first one was awkward, as usual, but the second one was weirdly nice.
What do you mean weirdly nice?
My mom was actually kind to Genesis, and she gave her this really expensive bottle of wine that not even I got.
Now, Mr. Soto, I want to ask you about your wedding day. Would you mind telling us about the morning of June 8th, 2019?
Sure. I woke up at 7 and I was getting ready, and then around at 8, my mom came into my room and she said that Genesis had disappeared and that we should just cancel the wedding.
Did you speak to anyone else after this?
Yes. Angel Rodriguez came into my room and she took me to the hospital.
And what happened when you got to the hospital?
I was 5 minutes late to seeing the love of my life alive. I just broke down. I was bawling, and I don't remember much, but all I remember was the doctor saying that Genesis died because of some type of poisoning, probably pesticide poisoning.
Mr. Soto, do you have any reason to believe that Ms. Petrillo could have been exposed to pesticide?
The first thing I thought of when I heard pesticide is peony estates, but that didn't make any sense because I ate and drank everything that Genesis had. The only thing we didn't share was that bottle of wine that my mom gave to her.
Thank you, Mr. Soto. No further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you, counsel. Defense, do you have a cross-examination of this witness?
Yes, Your Honor.
And you may proceed when you're ready.
Mr. Soto, are you aware of the contents of Exhibit 8?
Yes, I believe so.
I'm gonna share my screen with Exhibit 8. I think, yeah, hold on, give me a second. Just for the benefit of everyone. So this is the voicemail between that Genesis left the defendant, correct?
Yes, that looks to be it.
All right, and would you be upset if you got a voicemail like this one?
I mean, I guess, but I understand Genesis's intention by it because I was told her to have this conversation. I think it's important that they need to hash out their differences.
So you told Genesis to tell the defendant, quote, "No one wants it, you'll die alone at that sad place and no one will care."
No, not that specific statement. I'm just saying to hash out their differences.
So maybe that she'll never see you, or her maybe
Objection, Your
grandkids
Honor.
ever again?
Objection. This question calls for speculation.
Your Honor, I'm actually asking what the defendant, not the defendant, what Casey Soto how he would respond in this scenario.
First, plaintiff's counsel, can you explain your objection for me?
Yes, Your Honor. Opposing counsel is asking him to take a statement and imagine what he would do, or imagine how he would ask him to speculate his response or his reaction.
And defense counsel, your response to the speculation objection?
That this would be his own opinion on this, and it's just to get get his mindset on this specific message.
And to be clear, defense counsel, the question you're asking of this witness is how he would react to these words?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Plaintiff's counsel, are you in agreement on that? It's what Mr. Soto's reaction would be?
Yes, Your Honor.
As to speculation, I'm going to overrule the objection at this time.
Thank you, Your Honor. Would you like me to repeat the question, Mr. Soto?
I would appreciate that, yes.
How would you react if you were told that you would never be able to see the rest of your family ever again?
Objection, Your Honor. Rule 401 relevance.
Defense counsel, can you explain to me how Mr. Soto's reaction is relevant to trial today?
I have a line of questioning that would establish the importance, and it would help the benefit of the court to understand the severity of this voicemail.
So at this time, the jury is not hearing this conversation between us. Could you explain to me how this line of questioning is going to establish the relevance of this question?
I was going to I was going to ask Mr. Soto about how he would feel, and then detail a little bit more about the contents of this voicemail.
At this point, I do not believe that how Mr. Soto would react is particularly relevant to the issue at hand. You're more than welcome to ask him about what this voicemail says. However, his reaction doesn't seem relevant to me, so I'm going to sustain the question on that ground.
All right, thank you, Your Honor. Were you present when Genesis made this voicemail?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't like confrontation, so I most likely left in the middle of it.
All right. And are you completely okay with all of the contents of this voicemail?
I'm sorry, you cut out for a second.
Are you completely okay with all the contents of this email? Do you
Objection,
agree
Your
with them?
Honor. Relevance.
Yeah.
I don't see what Mr. Soto's view of this message has to do with today's case.
I'm going to go ahead and sustain that objection. I think what how Mr. Soto feels towards it doesn't appear to me to make any fact in this case more or less likely.
All right, thank you, Your Honor. All right. Here, I'll stop sharing my screen. Sorry. Did the defendant make any attempt to make peace with Genesis Petrillo?
The only time she ever said anything nice to her was when she offered the bottle of Carl wine, which we all know how that ended.
Okay, but did the defendant make any attempt to make peace with Genesis Petrillo, to your knowledge?
That's what the bottle of wine was, is a peace offering, but we know how it ended.
Were there any other instances of any attempts?
Objection, Your Honor. This question is asked and answered.
Counsel, can you explain to me how this is a different question from the one you just asked?
There are more instances than just the Carl wine, and I was trying to see if Mr. Soto could elaborate on those as well.
Counsel, then if you wouldn't mind for me, if you could rephrase your question to talk about those other events that you mentioned instead of
Right.
rephrasing the question. So at this point, I'm going to sustain the objection, but please continue with that.
I'll rephrase. Thank you, Your Honor. Are you aware of the lunch that the defendant had with Genesis Petrillo?
Yes.
Do you have any idea of the contents of that lunch?
I know that it didn't end in a fight, so yeah.
And what was your relationship like with the defendant?
It was good. The only bad part was her relationship with Genesis and how she could be extremely cruel to her, even to the point of threatening her, saying that you could be 6 feet under.
Was Genesis harsh in any way towards the defendant as well?
Sure, anyone would defend themselves, but it was nothing near my mom threatening my girlfriend to put her 6 feet under.
And why did you end up going through with the wedding at Peony Estates?
I wanted to pacify my mom because maybe if I did it her way, nothing bad would happen and maybe she'd be nice to Genesis for once.
During your earlier testimony, you said that Genesis told you she feared for her life to do the wedding at Peony Estates. Did that not influence your decision at all?
It did a little bit, yes, but I thought that going along with how my mom wanted it to go would maybe pacify her enough that she wouldn't hurt or possibly kill my bride.
Do you need a moment, Mr. Soto?
I think I'll be okay. I think I can get through it.
Then I'm going to ask you another question. Do you believe that your mother would actually harm Genesis Petrillo, or that it was just something that she said?
I don't want to think that she would harm Genesis, but I can't be sure if she did.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you, Counselor. Any redirect, Ms. Medina?
No redirect, Your Honor. I just asked that our witness be able to step down.
Perfect, Mr. Soto. You are excused.
Thank you.
And does the plaintiff have anything further for us today?
No, Your Honor. With that, we rest our case in chief and we ask for a brief 5 to 10 minute recess before moving on to defense.
Defense counsel, is a 5-minute recess something that y'all are okay with?
Yes, Your Honor.
And timekeepers, are we doing well enough to take a 5-minute recess?
Yes, we are.
Perfect, thank you. Well, then at this point, the plaintiff has closed their case in chief, and I will see y'all back, let's say 3:26. If representatives from each team could let me know when y'all are all back.
The plaintiff is ready to proceed.
Thank you.
Defense is also ready to proceed.
Perfect. Well, at this point, defense counsel, do you have any witnesses you'd like to present for us?
Yes, Your Honor, the defense would like to call Austin Lewis to the stand.
Austin Lewis, Mr. Lewis, if you could please take the stand. Defense counsel, you may begin when you're ready.
Hello, my name is Austin Lewis.
Hello. Can you please state your name for the record?
Sure, I'm Austin Lewis.
What's your experience in the winemaking business?
Yeah, so both of my parents worked in the winemaking business, and my mom had actually worked for Danny Francesio at the Rosie and Pedro winery. And then after my mom's death in 2012, I also started working at that same winery for Danny.
Did you interact with Harper Martini while you were employed for Danny Francesio?
I did. We worked closely, and Harper seemed to be experienced in making wine. I continued working with Harper after moving on from Rosie and Pedro.
When did you move on from Rosie and Pedro?
It was in January of 2015. So Harper had started his own winery called Peony Estates, and he offered to hire me as the head winemaker. I had always assumed that Rosie and Pedro would be more of like a stepping off point type of job. So I was ready to advance my career. So I accepted the offer from Harper.
What can you tell the jury about Peony Estates?
Yeah, so Peony Estates is a winery. It is located next to Salo Swamp. So there's lots of insects and pests. So organic pesticides that we have been using proved to be ineffective. So a few months after we opened, we switched to chemical pesticides.
What was your opinion on Peony Estates' use of chemical pesticides?
I felt like we were missing out on an opportunity to make our wines organic. And I also feared that a lack of adequate drainage could cause the grapes to be exposed to unsafe levels of pesticide.
What did you do in response to these fears?
I decided along with Harper that we would throw out any of the grapes that were waterlogged in those or were in waterlogged areas, because they could have been exposed to too much pesticide.
Did you have any other pesticide-related problems at Peony Estates?
We did in November of 2015. So Peony Estates was cited for leaving a pesticide sprayer in a shed near the kitchen. And I made sure that the employees knew that pesticides were to be kept in storage on the opposite side of the property, despite it being a longer walk.
Did you take any additional measures to prevent pesticides from reaching the grapes?
I did. In 2016, I personally began roping off the portions of the slope that had the worst drainage and disposing of those grapes when the harvest time came. And this resulted in us losing about 20% of our production each year.
Did you always personally rope off the waterlogged grapes?
Not always. On one occasion in August of 2018, I was out of town due to a family emergency. So I gave the task to Harper, and Harper agreed to follow my instructions. And when I later inspected the size of the harvest, it seemed to be approximately what I would expect based on prior years.
Did Peony Estates do anything else different with the pesticides that year?
We did. In June of 2018, we had a massive roach and mite infestation in both the wine cave and the bottling area. So by the mid time of that year of July 2018, we had determined to use chemical pesticides in both areas. We were in the middle of preparing the pesticide for use when the health inspector came by and cited us for storing pesticide too close to the wine cave and bottling area, even though we were going to be using the pesticide that very day, which is why it was there.
What did you do after that inspection?
Yeah, we cleared out the wine cave, we sprayed it down, waited the 48 hours, moved everything back in, and then for convenience, we built a new storage shed, which was 600 feet from the production facilities to store the pesticides in.
Did Peony Estates have any other experiences with the health inspector?
We did. In May of 2019, we developed another mite issue in the bottling area. We mistakenly moved the pesticide into the building before removing the wine. But as our rotten luck would have it, Of course, the health inspector came by that day, and Peonia Estates was cited again for having pesticide and also a blocked drain in the bottling area. We were ordered to retrain our employees on proper pesticide use, storage, and handling.
Did you get to retrain the employees?
I didn't. Harper told me, forbade me from spending additional time training the employees because it would indirectly
Objection,
cost.
Your Honor, to hearsay.
First of all, plaintiff's counsel, could you please explain what statements you are objecting to?
Yes, Your Honor. Specifically, I'm objecting to the statements of Harper Martini as being out-of-court statements being used for the truth of the matter asserted.
Defense counsel, do you have a response to that?
Your Honor, this witness's testimony is going to explain why they didn't retrain the employees. It's not specifically going to Harper's state of mind or opinions.
Counselor, it is my understanding, plaintiff counsel, that this is an objection to hearsay, right?
Correct.
Counselor, do you have any reason why these are not out-of-court statements being used for the truth of the matter asserted? Defense counsel, that's to you.
Your Honor, this statement is going to Austin Lewis's reaction to what the order was from their boss. It is not going to Harper Martini's mindset at that time.
Defense counsel, are you specifically referring to like the actions that Mr. Lewis will take as a response to hearing that?
Yes, Your Honor.
And defense counsel, one last question. To be clear, what is the exact statement that Mr. Lewis is telling us in court today?
Mr. Lewis is saying that he was forbidden from retraining the employees.
At this time, I'm going to sustain the objection. However, defense counsel, Mr. Lewis can testify as to what he was and was not allowed to do, and I don't think we need to go into any statements to get that point across.
Your Honor, motion to strike the portion that was elicited.
Granted, we're going to assume that when an objection is sustained, that the testimony that is inadmissible is stricken automatically.
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed, defense counsel.
Mr. Lewis, what did you do to train the employees?
Sure. So I hired a plumber to fix the drain, and then I put up signs which told the employees the correct procedures for handling pesticides.
Let's switch gears to the wedding at Peony Estates. Were you aware of the unemployed journalist Lonnie Paris being on the premises in the months prior to the wedding?
Yes, I was aware of Lonnie. Lonnie started doing regular tours of the winery in 2018 and would sometimes do so under an alias. I knew that Paris claimed to have overheard employees at Peony Estates talking about a surprise
Objection, Your Honor, to
inspection.
hearsay to the statements of Lonnie Paris.
Counsel, defense counsel, do you have a response to that?
Your Honor, I can move on from this line of questioning.
All right, sounds good. At this point, I'm going to sustain your objection. You may proceed, defense counsel.
Do you know anything about the circumstances surrounding the death of Genesis Petrillo?
I know that the basis of some of the accusations leveled against Harper had to do with an empty bottle of wine, which was found in the dumpster with pesticide. The reason that bottle was contaminated was due to the extra pesticide we had thrown
Objection,
in.
Your Honor, to a lack of personal knowledge.
Counsel, can you remind me exactly to which part Mr. Lewis does not have personal knowledge?
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Lewis was about to go into a line of testimony regarding knowing that why the bottle of Cara wine had tested positive for organophosphate pesticides. They have yet to lay any foundation how he would have any personal knowledge as to how that would be true and if it were true.
Defense counsel, what is your response?
Mr. Lewis is about to explain that he threw extra pesticide into that same dumpster several days beforehand, and that was the reason that the bottle was contaminated.
Your Honor, if I may respond.
Yes, if you could.
Your Honor, even if it's true that Mr. Lewis did in fact throw bottles of pesticide into that same trash can, he has no personal knowledge to know that that is the reason why it tested positive for organophosphate pesticides and is therefore inadmissible under Rule 602.
Counselor, I do tend to agree with you, plaintiff's counsel. I don't think Mr. Lewis knows exactly why the test came back, but he is free to testify what he did or did not do regarding those pesticides. So at this point, I'm going to sustain your objection, and defense counsel, you may proceed.
Mr. Lewis, did you throw pesticide into that dumpster the wine bottle was found in several days before the wedding?
Objection, Your Honor, to leading.
I'm going to overrule the objection. I think the witness can answer yes or no, but please be careful, defense counsel, and let the witness explain their answers.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes. So a few days before, as was mentioned, I did throw extra pesticide into that same dumpster where the empty bottle of wine was found.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, counsel. Plaintiff, do you have a cross-examination of Mr. Lewis?
Yes, Your Honor.
Perfect, and you may proceed when you're ready.
Good afternoon, Mr. Lewis. Now, you're here testifying today on behalf of the defendant, correct?
Yes,
And you've known the defendant for several years?
that is correct.
And you'd consider yourself close friends?
Yes, it's been a good business partner with Mr. Martini.
In fact, the defendant actually gave you the job that you currently hold at Peony Estates.
Yes, Ms. Martini did.
And it's true that you currently own 10% of Peony Estates?
Yes, I do.
And you're aware that if the defense loses this lawsuit, you will likely lose your job?
It would probably, perhaps Peony Estates wouldn't be able to continue as a business.
All right, so let's talk a little bit more about Peony Estates. Now, at Peony Estates, you utilize pesticides.
Yeah, like most agricultural areas, especially those near insects, which most do, we have to use pesticides.
And Mrs. Martini is the owner of Peony Estates?
Yes.
And she's familiar with the pesticides that you use there, correct?
Yeah, she's somewhat familiar, although I'm more of the person who's in charge of the winemaking. So Peony Estates also has like a bed and breakfast and other things. And usually Mrs. Martini is in charge of more the business side and those other services that we provide. So while she is generally, aware that we use pesticides, I'm more the person who actually knows the specifics about that.
Well, Mr. Lewis, directing you back to my question, Ms. Martini, to your knowledge, is familiar with the pesticides you use there?
As I was answering, generally familiar that we use them, the specifics, not as much.
Well, she knew exactly what kind of pesticides you used, correct?
Sure. I mean, she knew what it was called, bug off.
And she knew where you stored them. Isn't that true?
Yeah, she could probably generally figure out where they were.
Well, she actually knows specifically that the use of chemical pesticides is dangerous for humans.
I mean, I think most human beings know that.
But specifically, Ms. Martini told you that she knew how dangerous they could be, correct?
Correct. Mrs.
Objection,
Martini
Your
knew
Honor.
that.
For speculation.
How so, defense counsel?
Opposing counsel is asking my witness to speculate onto the knowledge of Harper Martini.
Opposing or plaintiff counsel, do you have a response?
Yes, Your Honor. I believe I specifically asked the witness that Ms. Martini told this witness that she was familiar with how dangerous chemical pesticides could be to humans. I'm not asking him to speculate. I'm simply asking him a yes or no question to a statement that he was told.
My understanding is as well that the question was on what Ms. Martini told Mr. Lewis, and for that reason, I'm going to overrule your objection. You may proceed.
So, Mr. Lewis, Ms. Martini told you how dangerous pesticides could be for humans, right?
Ms. Martini told me that they, yes, could be dangerous.
She also told you that they were poisonous.
I don't recall the specific language, but yes, generally she said they're dangerous for humans.
Well, specifically, she told you that they could be fatal.
I believe it could be. There was an instance where an employee had a bad reaction to some pesticides. He didn't die, but yes, I'm sure she was aware that it could be possible.
And the defendant also told you that pesticides, when mixed with wine, could go undetected.
Yes.
She told you that if you mix pesticide into wine, you couldn't smell it.
Ms. Martini was aware of that fact.
So let's go ahead and talk about Miss Martini and Miss Petrillo. Now, Mr. Lewis, you knew who Miss Petrillo was,
Yes.
and you've had several conversations with about Miss Petrillo with the defendant.
I've had a few, although I normally kind of avoided those conversations.
Well, when you did have those conversations with the defendant, she told you that if she could make Genesis disappear, she would have.
Obviously, as already been noted, she wasn't super thrilled about the idea of this marriage. However, she loved Casey more than that. But yes, I mean, she originally didn't want it to happen, the marriage.
Mr. Lewis, directing you back to my question, the defendant specifically told you that if she could make Miss Petrillo disappear, she would.
She would have preferred for her to disappear and for the marriage not to happen. And that was expressed to me by her.
Mr. Lewis, one more time, directing you back to my question, she told you that if she could make Miss Petrillo disappear, she would.
I believe I already answered. She would rather have her disappear and not have the wedding to happen. And that was clearly expressed to me by her.
I'll move on, Mr. Lewis. The defendant told you several times that she hated Miss Petrillo, is that right?
It was expressed to me on occasion that, yes, she hated Miss Petrillo.
Thank you. I have no further questions at this time.
Thank you, Counselor. Defense, do you have a redirect for this witness?
Your Honor.
Perfect. Well, at this point, Mr. Lewis, you may be excused. Defense Counsel, do you have any further witnesses to bring forth today?
Yes, Your Honor. The defense would like to call Harper Martini to the stand.
Ms. Martini, please take the stand.
Yes, I am Harper Martini.
Could you state your name and occupation for the benefit of the court?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Harper Martini, and I am the owner of Peony Estates.
What is your educational background?
I have a bachelor's in horticulture and business from Midland State University.
When did you start working in the wine industry?
Well, my family has actually been in the wine business for my whole life. I've been around it since I was a kid. I got my first real job in the wine industry when I was in college, and then I worked at Cumberland's farm winery. Yeah, do you want me to go on?
That should be good. When did you open up your own winery?
Okay. That was in January 2015 after leaving Rosie and Pedro.
And what all goes on at your winery, Peony Estates?
Yeah, so it's a bed and breakfast. We host a lot of big events, weddings, other related family events that go on there. It's a very popular place in the area.
What would you say put Peony Estates on the map?
Well, there was this 2017 Savor article, and it said that Peony Estates is an essential shop. And like people like really started like flocking to my place like during that time because the magazine said that we were the #1 emergent wine region, like where Rapid River Valley is, and that Peony Estates Winery is an essential shop. And then the only other winery was Danny Francasio's, which is like again Rosie and Pedro.
And what is your relationship with Casey like?
Casey, my child, and I have a great relationship. I love them more than anything else in the world. I actually am hoping to one day leave the entire winery to Casey as an inheritance for them to run.
What was your relationship with Genesis Petrillo like?
Well, to be honest, it wasn't always very good, and it was a bit rocky. I didn't really think that Genesis was a good match for my Casey for several different reasons, but ultimately I wanted Casey to be happy, and Genesis seemed to be the person that made Casey the happiest. So I really tried my best to make peace with Genesis in several ways.
And what did you do to try and make peace with Genesis?
I hosted the engagement party at my winery. Peony Estates for Casey and Genesis on July 21st of 2018. I also went out to lunch with Genesis, which I organized in January of 2019. And I told them that I wanted nothing more than Casey's happiness. And if that meant Genesis and Casey getting married, so be it. I'd have to live with that. I told Genesis that nothing mattered to me more than like my only child being happy for their life. And since Casey wanted to marry Genesis and I wanted a good relationship with Casey's future spouse, and we'd be having to work together for the wedding, I wanted nothing more to bury the hatchet once and for all. And then also at the engagement party that I held for them, I had a whole peace plan set in place, which was to give Genesis that special bottle of Cara wine, which is like a complex blend with notes of fall spices, currants, and a hint of smoked leather. And it was exactly the type of complex wine I had noticed Genesis fawning over during the tasting that we'd had with Sam Arnold in the past. So I took a bottle of Cara off of the shelf and I brought it upstairs to the main winery. Who better to receive that first bottle of Cara than Genesis? And I had a toast for them when I gave it to Genesis, and I said that I hope that our rocky start that we'd had.
Objection, Your Honor, narrative.
I do tend to agree, counsel, if you could add in some questions there to break it up a little bit. And Ms. Martini, if you could please keep your answers to the questions that your counsel is asking, that'd be perfect. Objection sustained. You may proceed.
All right, thank you, Your Honor. After the rehearsal dinner, did anything occur?
Yeah. So I awoke around 2:30 a.m. on June 18th of 2019 when I received a panic call from an employee that the employee had heard an unknown person had been rushed to the hospital. And I assumed that it was Genesis because only Genesis could mess up the wedding before it even happened. And
Objection, Your Honor, lack of personal knowledge.
If I may, Your Honor, this was a direct phone call that was given by one of the employees. It's mentioned in the affidavit of the defendant.
May I
counsel,
respond?
yes, briefly.
To clarify, Your Honor, I'm objecting to the witness's statement in saying that Genesis was the only one who could ruin the wedding.
Counsel, what is your response to that specific statement in terms of lack of personal knowledge?
It's just the opinion of the defendant. It's not like a statement of fact, I guess.
I tend to agree with defense counsel. I think that can just be her opinion. And so I'm going to allow her to continue with this line of questioning. Objection overruled, and you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Do you want me to go on?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I thought it was probably just food poisoning or alcohol poisoning because I'd seen Genesis drink a lot of wine the night before.
And did you go to the hospital to see Genesis?
No, I assumed that Genesis had probably just had too much to drink the night before and I went back to sleep.
And would you ever think about hurting Casey?
No. I would never do something like that. I love Casey more than anything.
And would you do anything to hurt your winery?
No, absolutely not. That's my livelihood.
So, would the poisoning of Genesis with wine that your company made do either of those things?
Yeah, it would definitely do both of those things.
Would you even consider poisoning Genesis at all?
No, I would never.
Objection, Your Honor, leading question.
I tend to agree, counsel. If you could please rephrase your question. Objection sustained.
Okay. Would you ever do anything to harm Casey's personal well-being?
No, as my only child, I would never want to do anything that would put them in harm's way.
Would that include hurting those close to Casey?
Yeah, most certainly.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you, counsel. Plaintiff, do you have a cross-examination of this witness?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Your only child is Casey Soto, right?
Correct.
And Casey was supposed to get married to Genesis.
Correct. Yeah.
But you didn't like Genesis very much, correct?
Yeah, we had a rocky relationship over the years.
In fact, you wanted to get rid of Genesis so badly that you tried to pay her $300,000, correct?
Yeah.
At one point, you even told Genesis to leave and save this family the headache. Otherwise, I will make you disappear, right?
Yes.
And on June 7th, 2019, the night of the rehearsal dinner, you continually referred to Genesis as a problem child during the first toast you made, correct?
Yeah.
And afterwards, you ran into Angel Rodriguez while you were holding a canister of pesticides.
Yes.
When Mrs. Rodriguez asked what was going on, you said, "It is for Genesis because Genesis is such a pest." Is that correct?
I was joking in that statement. Yeah. Like I made that as a joke.
Correct.
I'm sorry, what was that?
But you did say that, correct?
Yeah.
Later that night, you gave a second toast.
Correct.
And during that second toast, you publicly gifted the special Cara wine to Genesis.
Yeah.
But everyone else got Horizon wine.
Right.
Later, around 2:30 a.m., you got a phone call from an employee, right?
Yeah. From Austin.
You were informed that someone had been rushed to the hospital?
Yeah.
So after assuming it was Genesis, you went to her room, correct?
Correct.
But you did not find Genesis, right?
No.
Instead, you found the bottle of Cara on the floor empty.
Yeah.
That same bottle was the one you gave to Genesis, right?
Yeah.
Isn't it true that you even threw the bottle of Cara away?
Yeah.
And you are aware that the bottle of Cara later tested positive for organophosphate pesticide.
Right.
Isn't that the same pesticide you use at your winery, Peony Estates?
Yeah, that's the same.
And on June 7th, 2019, you were aware that mixing pesticides could be fatal, correct?
I'm sorry, you're cutting out. Can you repeat the question?
Sure. On June 7th, 2019, you were aware that mixing pesticides could be fatal, correct?
Okay, I'm sorry. It cut out one more time. If you could say it one more time. I'm sorry.
On June 7th, 2019, you were aware that mixing pesticides could be fatal, correct?
Correct.
You were also aware that if someone drank pesticides mixed with wine, they would not be able to smell it, correct?
Yeah.
And you had complete access to those pesticides, right?
Yeah, correct.
The morning of the wedding, you ran into Angel Rodriguez again, correct?
Yeah.
But before Mrs. Rodriguez said anything, you were already making plans to cancel the wedding. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
And that is because Genesis had been poisoned?
Wait, say that again, please.
That is because Genesis had been poisoned.
Right.
But at that point, nobody had told you about Genesis being in the hospital, right?
Yeah.
And nobody had even told you that Genesis was the one who was poisoned.
Right, but like I said, I had assumed it because of how the food poisoning and they drank a lot of wine the night before.
Yes. But when Genesis was in the hospital, you did not go see her, correct?
Right. Yeah, I went back to bed because I thought they'd be fine.
You also did not tell your son that his soon-to-be wife was in the hospital, correct?
Right.
And now you have admitted to being relieved, even happy that Genesis is no longer in your life. Is that correct?
I mean, no longer in my life, yes. Dead? Absolutely not. Like, that's still tragic.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you, counsel. Defense, do you have any redirect for this witness?
Yes, Your Honor. Would you ever harm, sorry, let me see that again. Would you ever do anything to hurt Casey?
No, never.
Would you consider harming Genesis to hurt Casey?
No, not.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Any recross, counsel?
No recross, Your Honor.
All right, Ms. Martini, you are excused. And defense counsel, do you have any further witnesses for us?
Yes, Your Honor. Oh, wait, I'm wrong attorney.
Yes, Your Honor. Defense counsel calls Blair Osborne to the stand.
Ms. Osborne, you may take the stand, and defense counsel, you may proceed when you're ready.
Thank you.
There.
Good afternoon. Could you please state your name for the record?
Yes, my name is Blair Osborne.
And what is your occupation, Ms. Osborne?
I'm the founder and owner of Bliss by Blair Events, my private event planning company that was voted #1 in the Red River Valley area 4 times. I'm the CEO, CFO, and whatever other roles there are, being the executive of my business.
Now, in your time as an event planner and founder and CEO, did you ever have cause to interact with Harper Martini or Peony Estates?
Yes, I did quite frequently.
And how did you meet Harper Martini?
Well, Harper actually got me out of a major bind in the spring of 2015. I was a brand new event planner, and I mean, I'll be the first to admit it. I was really struggling to stay organized, and I made the rookie mistake of double booking events all the time. So this one day, I found myself with a birthday party that was refusing to end and a wedding reception that was really ready to start. And I booked both of them for the same hotel ballroom in the mid-afternoon. So I was super desperate for an alternative venue. So I called nearly every nearby location with event space that I could think of. I then got a hold of Harper, who thankfully told me I could hold the wedding reception at Peony Estates Winery. And the evening was, of course, a huge success, and so much so that Bliss by Blair Events and Peony Estates began this amazing partnership together.
Could you elaborate on that partnership specifically?
Yes, of course. I hosted 83 events and have had several pre-event meetings at Peony Estates, and I had a warm and, I mean, of course, professional relationship with Harper and her staff at Peony Estates. Unfortunately, though, I've had to terminate my professional relationship with Peony Estates for the time being after the incident with Genesis.
Now, Ms. Osborne, were you involved in the planning of Casey Soto and Janice Petrillo's wedding?
Yes, Harper hired Bliss by Blair to plan their wedding at Peony Estates on November 6th, 2018.
How did the planning go?
Well, when Harper first asked me to plan Casey and Genesis's wedding, I was so excited and immediately said yes because I had a great relationship with Harper and Casey. That was before I realized, though, that this wedding would be the worst professional experience of my entire life.
Why was that the case?
Well, to be completely honest, it seems like this wedding was doomed from the start. At Harper and my first meeting on November 12th, 2018, Harper made it clear that Casey and Genesis did not know that I had been hired to plan their wedding or that their wedding would even be held at Peony Estates in June. So not telling Casey about my role in the planning the wedding made me really uncomfortable, but Harper was willing to pay me a 15% higher rate for planning the event if I agreed to stay discreet. So I worked quietly on the event through the fall, and I worked without Casey's participation to keep Harper happy. And I met initially with Casey and Genesis on January 12th, 2019. And that went very smoothly. Casey was really happy with my work, of course.
Objection, Your Honor. This witness is launched into a narrative.
Defense counsel, can you remind me as to what the question was that you had asked?
Yes, Your Honor. The witness had previously noted that this wedding was the worst professional experience of her life, and my follow-up question was why that was the case.
I do believe this witness is answering the question. However, defense counsel, if you could interject something in there, that way Ms. Osborne isn't giving us a narrative answer, that'd be perfect.
Yes, Your Honor.
Awesome. Objection sustained. You may proceed.
Let's move on to the events of June 7th, the date of the rehearsal dinner. Did you observe any disagreements or conflicts at this event?
Well, unfortunately, yes. Genesis and Harper were constantly antagonizing each other whenever they were together. And they had a disagreement during the rehearsal, but I didn't really hear anything about the specifics since I was working with the videography team to make sure everything was absolutely perfect. But unfortunately, the arguing got to the point that Casey actually asked me to help keep them as far away from each other as possible.
Were your efforts with that successful?
No, they really weren't. Harper and Genesis seemed to naturally kind of repel each other, but when they were together, they kept intentionally insulting each other in front of the guests.
Objection, Your Honor. Rule 602, lack of personal knowledge. Ms. Osborne has no way of knowing the intent of either the defendant or Ms. Petrillo.
Defense counsel, do you have a response to that?
Your Honor, I believe my witness was just giving her perception of the parties and her observations of how they seem to be acting.
Plaintiff's counsel, can you tell me exactly what part of Ms. Osborne's testimony is outside of her personal knowledge?
Yes, Your Honor, the witness was attesting to the defendant and Ms. Petrillo and how they seemed to be intentionally antagonizing each other, and she is claiming to have knowledge of the intent of either the defendant or Ms. Petrillo, when in fact she has no personal knowledge of their mindset or their intentions.
I tend to agree with you, plaintiff's counsel. I'm going to sustain the objection. Defense counsel, if you'd like to, you can get into specifically what she saw happening, but let's try to avoid characterizing the mindset or intentions behind the people that she witnessed.
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Ms. Osborne, what did you do to try and smooth things over?
Well, to be honest, I was trying to figure out a way to do that to prevent a showdown that I thought could potentially happen in front of the guests. But towards the end of the night, Harper actually seemed pretty eager to smooth things over, thankfully.
And what, if anything, did Harper do that corroborated your perception of her seeming eager to smooth things over?
Well, during dessert, Harper gifted Genesis this beautiful bottle of wine from Peony Estates and gave a very heartfelt toast. Honestly, I didn't expect such a genuine and lovely speech from Harper, and it was so touching that I teared up a bit. It really seems like Harper buried the hatchet right there in front of everyone. So that was really awesome.
Now, just to clarify, Harper gave this gift to Genesis in front of the entire wedding party.
Yes, she gave the bottle to Genesis in front of the entire group at the reception dinner.
No further questions, Your Honor.
All right. Plaintiff's counsel, do you have a cross-examination for us today?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Now, Ms. Osborne, you would have a long and close partnership with Peony Estates and its staff, correct?
Yeah, I do.
And you would even consider some of them family. Is that accurate?
Yes, they're, we have a great relationship, just as often family members do. So I consider them kind of like family, yes, in a friendly sort of way.
And Harper Martini is the owner of Peony Estates, correct?
Yes, she is.
And as such, you would consider Harper Martini very close to you.
Yeah, I mean, she got me out of a bind. That was really nice of her. And I've really enjoyed hosting things at Peony Estates. So that's been cool.
Yes, and now, Ms. Osmond, I'd like to talk about your role in planning the wedding. You were hired by the defendant to plan the Soto Patria wedding, correct?
I was, yes.
And you were paid a 15% bonus to be discreet.
That's true.
Yes, you were paid extra money to not let the couple know whose wedding you were planning of your involvement.
That's true, but I expected them to, of course, be, made aware of it eventually.
Yes, redirecting you to my yes or no question. You were paid extra money to hide your involvement from the couple. Yes or no?
Yes, I didn't feel like I was really having to hide it. I just was making inquiries.
Yes, thank you. And you were paid this money by the defendant, correct?
That's correct.
But the bride and groom were eventually brought into the planning process.
They were, yes, in January.
Yes, but the defendant didn't back off in her role, did she?
No, but it seems like everyone is having a collaborative effort in trying to make the wedding possible.
Collaborative is an interesting word because isn't it true that the defendant routinely contradicted the wishes expressed by the couple?
That's true. I was meaning collaborative, like everyone was working to make the wedding possible. I wasn't meaning they were working together.
Thank you for your clarification. I appreciate that. But didn't the defendant also go behind the backs of Mr. Soto and his fiance?
Yes. Well, it kind of seems like a lot of people were going behind each other's backs. I mean, oftentimes I couldn't really figure out who was doing what with the wedding planning process.
Again, redirecting you to my question, the defendant, yes or no, went behind the backs of Mr. Soto and his fiance?
Yes, initially.
Thank you. And isn't it true that you thought the theme of the wedding was more accurately crying and fighting?
That is true, unfortunately, yes.
And it was so bad that Mr. Soto actually pulled you aside and asked you to keep the defendant and his fiance apart.
At the rehearsal dinner, yes.
Yes, and it's also true that you were worried that something bad would happen between the two of them.
That's true. I didn't want anything.
Relevance.
Your Honor, I am this question actually was previously addressed in the direct, so relevance has already been established in the direct.
Yes, well, before you do, defense counsel, can you tell me exactly what was the question you were objecting to?
The question was my witness's perceptions of whether or not the something bad might happen with regard to the conflicts.
And counselor, yes, or defense counsel, yes or no, was this something that you guys have brought up on your direct examination?
No, not regarding whether something bad might happen as a result of the conflicts.
Plaintiff's counsel, can you explain to me why or whether or not you agree with defense's counsel's assessment of that question?
I disagree, Your Honor. In the direct, the witness actually made a statement that she was worried about a brutal showdown occurring between the defendant and Ms. Petrillo. That was her response to opposing counsel, and as such, this question has been addressed and relevance has been established.
I am not sure. I don't remember exactly. At this point, because I'm not sure, I'm inclined to overrule the objection. But I think it is a valid objection. And I think if we had our court reporter, we could resolve this issue effectively.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Ms. Osborne, I would like to talk about the rehearsal dinner and the defendant's behavior. It changed from prior experiences, is that correct?
What do you mean by changed?
Let's talk about the toast, for instance, the second toast. Isn't it true that the defendant was kind to Ms. Petrillo?
That is true. Yes, it was a touching thing.
Yes, and she even gifted Ms. Petrillo a bottle of unique wine.
That's true, yes.
And in front of Ms. Petrillo and the entire attending party, she made it very clear that that bottle was specifically meant for Ms. Petrillo.
That's true.
And she also made it explicitly clear that only Miss Petrillo was meant to drink from it.
That's true, yes.
Now, finally, I want to ask about a meeting that you had with the defendant. Isn't it true that the defendant played a voicemail to you from Miss Petrillo?
Yes, that is true.
And in response to this voicemail, the defendant said that one day, Genesis will drink the wrong thing and it will kill her.
That is true, yes.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you, counsel. Defense, do you have any redirects for this witness?
No redirect, Your Honor.
At this point, thank you. Ms. Osborne, you are excused. And defense counsel, is there anything further that you would wish to present?
No, Your Honor. Defense counsel rests.
Thank you. Timekeepers, can you inform me as to how close we are to all loss?
My understanding is that all loss for Eastern time is around 5. For us in Central time, it's around 4, which means we have around 45 minutes.
Perfect. Is a 5 to 10 minute recess satisfactory to both parties?
Plaintiff is fine with either 5 or 10.
Same, Your Honor.
Well, let's meet in the middle. We're gonna say 8 minutes, and if y'all could come back at 4:20, that would be awesome. 4:20, I'm in the Eastern time zone, so 8
Yes,
minutes from now. Perfect. Are counsels from both sides here and ready to go?
Yes, Your Honor, the plaintiff is ready to proceed.
The defense is also ready to proceed.
Perfect. With that, plaintiff, you may begin when you're ready.
And Your Honor, may I reserve any remaining time for my rebuttal?
Yes, we will consider any time you have left to be carried over for rebuttal.
Okay. May it please the court. She thought no one would notice. Members of the jury, we've heard a lot of testimony today, and we've seen a lot of different pieces of evidence. And so I can understand why that might be a little overwhelming at first. So before we comb through the evidence, I want to take a step back and remind you of the events that brought us here today. Genesis Petrillo and Casey Soto were in love. They decided to get engaged, and their wedding was supposed to be held at Peony Estates, the defendant's winery. But when the defendant saw an opportunity to make Miss Petrillo disappear, she took advantage of that. She thought no one would notice. On June 7th of 2019, the defendant knew how dangerous pesticides could be if someone were to drink them. And so naturally, she thought no one would notice if she were to mix pesticides inside that bottle of Cara wine that she gave Miss Petrillo. When Miss Petrillo drank that bottle of wine, members of the jury, she slipped into a coma, and she never woke up. She never made it down the aisle, and Mr. Soto never got to see her walk down it. Today, we are charging the defendant with civil battery for her acts and her intentions that were committed on June 7th of 2019. Now, the law requires us to prove three things when it comes to civil battery. The first being that the defendant committed an act. The second being that that act was intended to cause harmful or offensive contact to the plaintiff. And third, that the plaintiff did in fact suffer harm. We had to prove these things to you by a preponderance of the evidence, which simply means more likely than not. So let's go ahead and talk about how we prove those things. First, that the defendant committed an act. Now, there's no denying in today's case that the defendant gave that bottle of wine to Ms. Petrillo on June 7, 2019. We heard that from Ms. Rodriguez, from Mr. Soto, and from the defendant herself. Now, it's true that we didn't have a witness come forward today to say that they saw Ms. Martini put the pesticide inside of that bottle of wine. But members of the jury, all the law requires us to prove is that it's more likely than not that she put the pesticide inside that wine bottle. Now, what we heard today from Ms. Rodriguez is that right before she gave that bottle of wine to Ms. Petrillo, she was carrying a canister of pesticides. And when asked what that pesticide was for, the defendant answered, "It's for Genesis." Members of the jury, it's no secret today that the defendant told us on the very stand herself that no one had told her that Ms. Petrillo was suffering from pesticide poisoning on the morning of June 8th, but somehow she knew. Members of the jury, the reason that Ms. Martini knew that Ms. Petrillo had died from pesticide poisoning or was suffering from it at the time was because she's the one that made it happen, because she was the one that committed the act. Now, moving on to the second element that we had to prove, that the defendant intended to cause harmful or offensive contact to the plaintiff. Now, almost every single witness today that took the stand told you how much Mrs. Martini, the defendant, hated Ms. Petrillo. She said that if she were given the opportunity, she would make Ms. Petrillo disappear. She said that one day, Ms. Petrillo is going to drink the wrong thing and it's going to kill her. And it did, members of the jury. Not only that, but the defendant told you herself today that she did not care for Ms. Petrillo at all. In fact, she made so many threats to Ms. Petrillo that she feared for her own life. Mr. Soto took the stand today and told you that he was so scared of what his mother was capable of that he wanted to keep Ms. Petrillo away from the defendant. And lastly, we had to prove that Ms. Petrillo did in fact suffer harm in today's case. Now today you heard from a very important expert, Mr. Dr. Kwan. Dr. Kwan took the stand today and he told you just how much Ms. Petrillo suffered that night. He told you that when she came into the emergency room, she couldn't even talk. She was vomiting, she was involuntarily twitching because she was poisoned with pesticide. Members of the jury, after he confirmed that there was pesticide in the bottle of wine and in the contents of Miss Petrio's stomach and vomit, she died. And she's no longer with us today. Now, today we have proven all three of these elements by a preponderance of the evidence. In a few moments, the defense is going to have the opportunity to try and convince you otherwise. But after that, I'll get to talk to you one more time. And I'll remind you of what actually happened that day. And I'll remind you how she thought no one would notice. And it's at that point that I'll ask you to find the defendant liable for battery. Thank you.
Thank you, plaintiff's counsel. Does the defense, would they like to present their closing arguments?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed when you're ready.
May it please the court. Your Honor, throughout the course of this trial, my co-counsel and I have proven that battery had never took place. According to Burdett v. Copenhaver, the elements of battery are as follows: an act by the defendant, an intent to cause harmful or offensive contact on the part of the defendant, and harmful or offensive contact to the plaintiff. During the testimony heard today, it has been made known that not only did Harper Martini not intend to cause harm to Genesis Petrillo, but she also did not know she had done so. We have heard from multiple witnesses that Harper Martini dearly loved her son, Casey Soto, and would never do anything to harm him. This would include killing his soon-to-be wife. We saw Austin Lewis, a longtime employee at Peony Estates and head winemaker there, testify about the procedures for pesticides and their use in storage. Next, we heard from Harper Martini herself, who testified that she would never do anything to hurt Casey or Peony Estates, and that poisoning Genesis would do both of those things. She also testified to her attempts to smooth things over with Genesis. Lastly, Blair Osborne testified that the defendant and Genesis did not get along. However, at the rehearsal dinner, the defendant seemed to, quote, bury the hatchet with Genesis Petrillo. All of this testimony proves that the defendant did not have the intent of harming or killing Genesis Petrillo, only wanting a better relationship with her soon-to-be daughter-in-law. The defense would have you believe that the only thing in the defendant's heart was hate. However, the biggest thing in her heart was reconciliation. The defense called on Angel Rodriguez, Dr. Jimin Kwan, and the defendant's son, Casey Soto. Angel Rodriguez testified that she saw Genesis Petrillo drink champagne, an entire bottle of wine, and buy numerous rounds of shots for many of the party guests, while possibly drinking some herself. Dr. Jimin Kwan testified that it was entirely possible for Genesis to have died from alcohol poisoning, even saying that Genesis smelled of alcohol when she was admitted into his care. And lastly, the plaintiff called upon Casey Soto to try and prove that he was scared of his mother, even though he still had the wedding at Peony Estates. The defense would have you believe this scary story so close to Halloween. However, there is no evidence backing the battery claims in the intention of Harper Martini. We have proved throughout all the testimony through the defense and the plaintiff that the intent to harm Genesis Petrillo directly was never there. And Your Honor, we ask that you find the defendant not liable for this claim. Defense rests.
And thank you, counsel. Plaintiff, would they like to use the rest of their time for rebuttal?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed when you're ready.
Members of the jury, defense counsel just got up here and they tried to tell you that the defendant neither intended to harm Ms. Petrillo, nor did she know that she had in fact harmed her. But that's not exactly what we heard in court today. In fact, we heard that she knew that Ms. Petrillo had in fact been poisoned with pesticides somehow before anybody had even told her so. In fact, when she was asked what the canister of pesticide was for, she told you herself that she said, the pesticide is for Genesis and so is the wine. Defense counsel also brought up the fact that Dr. Kwan got up here and tried to tell you how it's possible that Ms. Petrillo was suffering from alcohol poisoning. However, his ultimate conclusion in today's case was that Ms. Petrio's symptoms were not consistent with alcohol poisoning, but rather the symptoms considered when assessing pesticide poisoning cases. Members of the jury, the defendant thought that no one was going to notice when she put that pesticide in that bottle of wine that she knew would go undetected if anybody were to look at it or to even smell it. Members of the jury, we noticed. And we hope today, we are confident today that you also noticed. And because of that, we ask you to find the defendant liable for civil battery. Thank you.
Thank you. And at this point, we have concluded our trial. First of all, really great job, guys. We're going to take a couple of minutes for me and my fellow judge to go ahead and fill out the ballots and make sure that everything's all good. And then we will proceed with some comments for y'all.
Mason, mine is submitted. Whenever you submit yours, let me know, and I will send Elliot a message.
Perfect. Give me 1 second. If I could ask a favor from the competitors, if the witnesses could pop on the screen for me and just let me match a face to the character name just to make sure that I've got my things right. Perfect. Yes, okay. And perfect. Yes. Awesome. And you can go ahead and text Elliot. I thank you, witnesses. Y'all are very good. If you guys would like, y'all can all come on the screen for comments so we can look at y'all, make eye contact. Before we proceed with comments, I think we need to make sure that they have been received properly.
Yeah, Elliot read my message. He should get back to me in just a sec. Confirmed, we can do comments. Mason, you're muted.
Yes, I just realized that. Perfect. Before we start with comments, I just want to let y'all know that we do appreciate that y'all are coming, and we recognize that it's exciting and nerve-wracking to have your first tournament. I'm going to let our scoring judge start since y'all have heard from me for the past 2.5 hours. So, Christian, if you want to go ahead and take it on.
All right. Thanks so much. Hey, everyone. My name is Christian Sulia. I am an AMTA alum. I compete on Wake Forest teams. And I am now a paralegal specializing in estate planning. Fun stuff. So this case, you know, the only thing that I care about is the one thing you can't talk about, which is who the money is going to go to, assuming that the estate of Genesis is the prevailing party. Alas, life goes on. So I guess I'll just do some overall comments. And I did not type specific comments because I only have one screen. It's too hard for me to go back and forth. But if you do want specific comments, I'm more than happy to give them to you. So the first one is that, you know, we are online, obviously, and that's a very different setting. But many times I was able to tell when competitors were using notes. You know, it's very evident to me when you're reading right to left on the screen or anything like that. Even if your head isn't moving, your eyes tell a big story. Unfortunately, for fellow glasses wearers, that counts double. Angel Rodriguez, I did not see you reading notes, so you're in the clear. But it's very obvious. So I just want to say that in case you don't think it is obvious, because it is. Second is, I thought that we could have done a lot more objecting. That's just a general comment. All right, I am not sure who did it, but there is no such thing as an improper impeachment. That's not an objection in the real world. If I was presiding as judge, I would not have been as kind as Mason. I probably would have just said overruled right away and just let you decide what to do with that. There's no such thing as an improper impeachment. It's a mock trial thing purely. All right, I used to do a lot of expert stuff as an attorney, so I'm going to talk about some expert stuff. The first is I thought that my philosophy is that you always object lack of foundation under 702 if you're crossing the expert. It doesn't matter how much foundation they put on there. There can always be more. So, whether that be you use the case law, Terror Associations of Midlands versus Merrill Dow. It used to be called Davis v. Adams, I want to say, was the, I don't know what they call it anymore, but that was the one where it's like, just because it's a relevant method doesn't mean it's a reliable one. Those were case laws that I would use pretty much every trial. I suggest individuals who cross experts to use that as well. And then for the bias pocket for the expert as well, I think that Ms. Canales, I thought your performance today was wonderful all around. I was very impressed, but I do have a suggestion for your cross that you did, and this is the same as whoever was crossing the expert witness. I always save the bias pocket for the end, and here's why. And other coaches or other no, it's not Richards versus Mississippi Barbecue, if that's it. No, that's about demonstratives and hearsay. I'm a mock trial nerd. I know this stuff. If your coaches tell you different things than what I say, listen to your coach. That is always the case. And if Mason tells you something different than me, this is a mock trial. It's very subjective. I believe that the bias pocket at the end is more effective, and here's why. Because when crossing, I have 3 or 4 different pockets. First, I want to talk about X. You ask those few questions. Next, I want to talk about Y. Those few questions. Finally, I want to talk about Z. Few questions. And now I want to talk to you about why you said all of that. And if it's an expert, I go even more, and in my signpost language is usually, I want to talk to you about why you reached those conclusions. And then I go into the bias, then I ask those questions, and it completely, I think that's relatively effective, but that's just my thing. Next, that wine, the bottle of wine, it has like a brand name of some sort that they made up. People kept pronouncing it really different ways, and that's something that bugs me. People were calling it Cara, Cora. It's, just pick one and stick with it. People on the same side were doing it. At one point, the same attorney used it 2 different ways. So it's just one of those things for consistency and professionalism. Just, as a team, pick one. If the other team is going to call it something else, that's fine. You don't call them out on it, because there's no correct way per se to call on it. But, at least for your own team on each side, stick to one pronunciation. A couple years ago, the Riley Winter case versus TBD, people had a really hard time figuring out how to say Pulitzer. Some people called it Pulitzer, and that infuriated me equally. When referring to someone, I practice. I'm not a practicing attorney, but I do law in Florida. In Florida, every time that you call someone by their first name, you get a fine from the judge. If you do it enough times, you can be held in contempt. And so if you're calling someone by their first name without their last name, just, my name's Christian. If an attorney says, Christian, you said this, they would get a fine. So whenever you're referring to someone, either use their full name or just say, excuse me, Mr. Sulia, or Someone kept calling Genesis Genesis. Genesis was Mrs. Genesis or Miss Genesis or whatever, if that's her last name. I don't know. I just think of the car. But last statement is I heard a lot of text message notifications throughout the trial. I actually messaged Mason and was like, just want to make sure it's not him. He's the judge. He can do whatever he wants. But to the best of my knowledge, even in the Zoom sphere, you're not supposed to be texting each other. I may be incorrect on that. But if you have text linked up with your MacBook, there's a do not disturb button, or you could just delete the function for while you are competing. And I get that, like, sometimes your mom might text you or dad or, whoever, significant other, and you can't control that. But at least to me, like, I heard a lot of texting going on during objection battles. And for me, that's like big red flags blaring all around, because I'm like, at this point, I can't judge you on your abilities because you might be getting external help. And that's just unfair to the other competitors here. That is all for me, but you did a wonderful job. I think that this is the second time I've heard this case. I don't judge a team or anything like that, so I did not know any of the facts of this case before today. I thought you all did a much better job than my morning trial of describing the general facts of the case. I know what happened, so kudos.
And please don't discriminate on the basis of Mr. Suglia's age for referencing the Riley Winter case. But I've got a few general comments. A lot of them I'd like to echo about the phone, about identifying by the first name. For me, it's always been Mr. or Miss last name tends to work well. And another thing on that is also perhaps the title. Because like Judge Suglia, I didn't know this case at all until I walked in today. And, people talking about martini this or like whatever it may be. Like, we have a hard time just remembering names and associating that to different people throughout the case. So it's often very helpful. And I think plaintiff's counsel did it a lot when they just referred to the defendant as the defendant. But you can also do that for other witnesses. Perhaps you can say something like the parent, the spouse, whatever it may be. But like, doing things like that help us to kind of put characters into the story and not get lost saying like, who is this person? I will disagree in terms of, in terms of the idea of an improper impeachment. He's right. It is not a real objection. The actual response is hearsay, as you are reading the witness's affidavit onto the record. And an appropriate time to do so is to correct a prior inconsistent statement. And that's why you can bring the affidavit in. I'm nice, I guess. It's kind of a first time I've heard that one, but I kind of let it slide and kind of understood there are also some technical difficulties behind it. And on technical difficulties, if y'all are aware that you guys may be having some, perhaps it's an internet issue. I think I noticed like someone might have been on their phone, whatever it may be. Sometimes it's nice to go ahead and just, if you know that it's going to happen, is to just let us know at the beginning. Like, we're not going to count off for it if someone's like computer died or their internet went out or whatever it may be, but it certainly is helpful to kind of get that out of the way. I would love to just highlight, this is the character Austin Lewis. Like, your energy came across so well throughout your direct examination, your cross-examination. Like, oftentimes when you're on this online setting, it's kind of hard. Like, you might sound more boring or whatever it may be, but I didn't feel like you were any different as if you were like sitting on the witness stand. And then on the other side of that, I really liked the cross-examinations of the plaintiff, or from the plaintiff, especially the first two. Like, I thought they were really well done and they really hit home a lot of the points that they wanted to make. And that's pretty much all I'm going to give you. I have plenty of other individual comments you're welcome to ask me. One thing I do want to forewarn you guys about is that I'm not a judge that gives you 9s and 10s only. Like, I start at a 5 and I go up and down, and a 5 is what I think is an average round. So what that means is, please don't be upset by the actual number. I would instead look to what that number looks like compared to, say, the person who crossed you, or perhaps to like what I gave other directs, because I typically get a lot lower numbers than what some of you might be used to when you see like, a bad direct was a 7. To me, like a bad direct is like a 2, and some people just need to be warned about that from the outset.
Yep, I gave 3s and 2s, so.
Cool. Well, with that, I think that is all we have for you. Y'all are also welcome to stay and ask any other questions, ask for comments, whatever it may be. But once again, thank y'all, and y'all did a great job. Oh, and a little bit about me. I did mock trial at Furman University when I was an undergrad, and I just graduated now in law school right now at Georgia State in Atlanta. Was an attorney, both sides for all 4 years that I did mock trial in undergrad.
Thank you all. I'll stay for 5 or 10 minutes if people want to ask individual questions, but it is also 4:50 p.m. on a Saturday, so please leave if you want to.
Mr. Is it Sugila?
It's Sulia. The G is silent, like
Sulia.
lasagna.
Okay,
Yeah.
Mr. Sulia, I have a question about a comment that you made with regard to saying the last names. Do you, or versus like saying just calling them by their first name, do you recommend calling them by their last names or like their full name for witnesses as well?
So yeah, I think of regardless of the person who you're referring to. So for example, I think that only the plaintiff is here right now at this point, but I thought the plaintiff did a very good job for the defendant. You call the defendant if you're the plaintiff. You do that because you're essentially dehumanizing them.
Right.
Whereas the defense was mistakenly calling the defendant Martini without Miss Martini or anything like that, which dumb name to begin with. So I'm not gonna, count too much, but really, if I was the defendant, I would keep trying to kind of do some of what Mason was saying and qualifying with like, Miss Martini, the loving mother of Mr. Soto was doing XYZ. And for you all, keep going with what you're doing with calling the defendant. That's the right thing. But, if Casey Soto's on the stand, you want to say, good afternoon, sir. Please introduce yourself to the members of the jury. Say, hi, I'm Casey Soto. Mr. Soto, why are you here today? And, I would always refer with Mr. and as Mason said, which I think is a great comment, qualifying with a profession or kind of like how they fit into the scheme. It's very helpful because this morning, I think, it was a great round, very even matched, but neither side did a particularly good job of telling me what was going on. And given that I believe Mason and I, neither of us are coaching at the moment, at least I'm not, but I had no idea about the case facts or anything like that. So I was completely lost for most of the round. And I was scoring purely on performance, which you're supposed to only do performance and objections and stuff like that. Once you're more familiar with the case, especially if you're a coach, it's easier to score people on, I guess, quality of facts and whether they were able to get something in that might be a little harder if you're going against a better team. But that would be my suggestion for the names.
I like that comment on the story. I felt the same way. I didn't even realize that the defendant was the parent of the wedding, and I've already seen a full round until, I didn't learn until this one.
All right, thank you. That's my question. I don't know if anybody else from our side has questions.
I have a quick question just because you said you were an expert, and I play the expert on the defense for this.
Got it.
And I'm not going to spare any punches in saying that the defense expert honestly sucks.
I heard the defense expert this morning, and they basically have to admit that they think, that they're wrong.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering about is everything that the defense expert says is, well, it could be this, but really I agree with this other expert. And so I was just wondering how best to handle an expert like that, to be able to draw my own conclusions and things like that.
Sure. So, and I think AMTA usually kind of, not all the time, but I think they usually have they have been guilty of doing this. I think I'm trying to remember the case of 2 years ago with the chimpanzee and the TV studio.
Danny Kosak.
Danny Kosak. The
Yeah.
defense expert,
Yeah,
the
was that
defense
clear,
expert for the, yeah, the defense expert for that one was pretty much the exact same level of garbage.
McCoy.
Yeah, and the way that we framed it, because I remember I was working with a defense expert at that point, was basically just go head first and be like, even during the direct, be like, listen, I know this guy, or gal, I know this, or person, I know this person, and they are a good person. They know their facts, and most likely they're right. But I don't want them to mislead you by telling you that this is the only thing that could have happened, because it's not, and that would be unfair. And here's why. And I think that a really good thing for those defense experts, I will say, I didn't have that many critiques for the plaintiff. One of them is I didn't think that the demonstrative landed very well. It was, a little too jargony. My thought about a demonstrative is it should either bring about something that you couldn't do without, as in provide information, or it should be something that's like zingy, brings out your personality, and it's going to get you some character points for the expert. And I usually lean heavy into option 2. For the defense, usually what I like to do is you can't really do it because it's Zoom, but it's like in person, it would be the Velcro on the whiteboard where, these are all their conclusions, one by one, every fact, you got to tear one off because it's wrong and stuff like that. For a defense, like that usually is relatively effective because, the judges, we are mostly paying attention for the whole trial. But there are some points where we might be, writing comments, filling out our ballot or something like that. And so when you do something like that, you're forcing us to pay attention. You're forcing us to realize what's going on. And I always found that to be, remarkably effective, was to do the demonstrative for that. And my suggestion for demonstrative is we would usually name it something that has like an interesting acronym. So, if it's a C word, an A word, and a T word, then it's the CAT method. Or one of the things that I always did would be use 3 or 4 different words that had the same first letter. And so if it's that, we would call like the 3 C's or the 4 C's method. And that way you can integrate it with your direct. And yeah. I don't know. What do you think, Mason?
So I also was an expert director for a lot of my time, experts and character witnesses. And the demonstrative I liked better than Mr. Sulia did in terms of, I thought it was effective. However, what I was missing was like you to actually go in and explain these things to me. Like, I even think I wrote a comment, the last one in particular, I think it was about the heartbeat. Like, I was sitting there thinking, what on earth does this mean? What kind of heartbeat is this? And so I think perhaps going in and trying to make it in a way that we understand. And I think it can also, probably go through a bit of formatting. It's online. You can make it in color. You don't have to worry about the budget behind that. Like, I've used Rubik's cubes that like to show incomplete memory encoding. I've used models of the brain, of a chimpanzee brain. I've used skeleton. I've used all types of stuff in terms of expert demonstratives. Anything to keep our attention, because there are plenty of times where I was writing a comment and an objection would come out, and I would sit there and say, well, I don't remember the exact wording of this, and I think it's important that I figure that out. But if I'm looking at something cool and you're explaining something to me, like, I'm hooked and I'm focused only on what you're doing.
Well, I don't have any other questions, so I'm going to go ahead and go. But thank you guys so much for judging.
Yes,
of course. No problem at all.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you all so much. Our pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.